Public comment, the issue or items that are not on the agenda that may be raised by the public at this time. Citizens speak from the podium. Begin by stating their name and limit remarks to 3 minutes. Committee members may request to have an item placed on a future agenda for discussion. The committee takes public comment at all regular agenda items during the discussion of those items. Do we have any public comment? All right, we'll move on to the consent agenda. Consider moving to approve the January 18 Shelter Advisory Committee regular meeting minutes. Has everyone had a chance to look them over? A motion?
I make a motion to approve.
Second?
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. Those are approved. Regular agenda, discussion and possible action related to monthly shelter numbers for January.
Thank y'all. We have, of course, we postponed our February meeting due to lack of agenda items. So first we'll go through January activity, let you know kind of what we saw at that time as far as intake and outcomes at the animal shelter. Of course, 0 adoptable pets were euthanized. That puts us 21 months in a row now, approaching 2 years of the no-kill initiative. We also had 20 citizens using the microchip clinic, which we've discussed in the past, ways to bump that up. And so that's about average for us without us doing a specific fair or event specifically for microchipping. So normal activity there. We also had 404 new arrivals. This is up from December. In December, we saw a tremendous amount of cold, wet, rainy weather, which resulted in fewer animals being out, fewer calls for service, which did allow us to catch up on some items procedurally in-house. But in January, we saw that get back up to the normal level. Of the animals in the shelter, 166 were adopted. Of course, that's about that's a little above average for us. That includes transports as well out to other agencies. We had 55 animals redeemed by owner, so that's a little up, largely due to folks, it's in conjunction. Some of that is because animals are microchipped, or we notice them on the local lost and found website, helpmegethome.com. And then I would say about half of it is that, and about half of it is folks redeeming their animals after a rabies quarantine period. That's the similar breakdown than y'all have seen in the past as well. We did have to consider euthanizing 221 animals due to either being feral, injured, sick, or aggressive. And I do have information on that. So at the end of January, we had 227 animals left in the shelter, which is a manageable amount for us with our facility as it is right now. We did achieve a 66% live release rate, which was excellent. That is above average for us. So of the 221 animals that we did have to consider euthanizing, I did want to point out 130 of those were cats. As we see, the majority of those usually are cats, unfortunately. We did look at 83 dogs for that same procedure, 5 foxes, 1 deer, 1 chicken, and 1 armadillo. So it's unusual. We usually see foxes being released in the wild, but this was when we had our first positive rabies result, and so we did see more foxes present. It's just the time of year that those animals are more active. It is why we have rabies start coming up in late January into February, and so we saw more foxes than normal in January because those animals are more active at that time. And the armadillo and the chicken and the deer, of course, were because they were injured. Yes, sir.
None of the fox were rabid, were they?
1 fox was rabid. So we had our first positive rabies result of the year. I apologize. We had a rabid skunk in January. My apologies. So it wasn't one that we euthanized. We did have a case in the northeast side of town where a skunk wandered into a home through a dog door, which is an unusual activity for a skunk. Their family dog attacked and killed the skunk. We did, in those instances, we do go ahead and do a rabies specimen test on the wildlife that was deceased, and it actually came back positive. And so we implemented a procedure to notify the neighborhood. We handed out leaflets. We did media outreach to let folks know. Luckily the animal that bit and killed the skunk was current on rabies vaccine. We see that animals that have had a couple rabies vaccinations in its lifetime, our representatives at DSHS have let us know that it's very uncommon that they would contract rabies at that time. So the animal is finishing up its 45-day observation period. The dog is not showing any signs of contracting the rabies that the skunk had, largely due to the fact that it was rabies vaccinated and immediately taken into quarantine. So my apologies. None of the fox were positive for rabies, but we did have a rabies positive in January. We've also had one since in February.
Did send the heads to the fox heads? Did you send them in?
Yes, so what we implemented, since it is the time of year where, we got our first rabies result, that's unusual for us to have it that early, and it's unusual for us to have more than one in a year. Our neighbors to the south, I have a contact in Sonora, they regularly have more than 20 positive rabies results in their community, largely due to there being no animal control in their community, and so it's kind of just free breeding there. So we went above and beyond, and anything that was a high risk for carrying rabies, we went ahead and euthanized, and if there was any sign of suspicious behavior, we went ahead and rabies specimen tested. So we've had a number of animals that we've sent off for specimen that did not have a human exposure or an animal exposure, but we did go ahead and test because they were active during the broad light of day, or rabies will make an aggressive animal kind, and it'll make a domestic animal aggressive. And so when we see a skunk that is usually very shy wander into someone's home, that was probably the first sign that that animal was not well, and we would have tested it even if there hadn't been that other animal exposure. So another way to break down the number of animals euthanized, 113 were due to being sick, injured, or failure to thrive. 58 were feral cats. 43 were either due to aggression or bite quarantine. It's not uncommon that an animal comes in for rabies quarantine. The family says, I don't want this animal back. It's either a stray or the family says, no, I don't want it anymore. And so we would go ahead and consider euthanasia at that time, because most animals with a bite history we would not consider adoptable. And so those are the animals there. 6 were wildlife, and 1 was an owner-requested, an elderly pet that the family requested that we euthanize. And of course, 0 animals were euthanized due to time or space. So that is January.
Any questions? Okay, next we'll move on to discuss some possible action related to monthly shelter numbers for February.
So for the month of February, as we're moving along, and I apologize, January should have said 22 months in a row of the No-Kill Initiative, because now we're at 23 months in a row. March is our 2-year anniversary of adopting that. We did have 25 citizens using the microchip clinic, so a little up from the month before. You'll see that new arrivals were largely static. Only 2 more new arrivals in February versus January. 178 were adopted, so that is up tremendous. The month before we were at 166, so that's a banner month for adoptions there at 178 animals. That was in part due to a couple transports in addition to adoptions. Then, of course, 60 redeemed by owner, which was helpful to have that number increase. And then 173 were euthanized. So because our euthanasia was down, if that looks like an arrow to some people, and because our adoptions were up and our redemptions were up, that meant that our live release rate was the highest it has been ever at 71%. So that's certainly something to be able to report to the public, that the initiatives that we're doing are working, the tasks that our staff and PAWS staff are taking are working. To achieve an 80% live release rate would be our dream, and I think that we are on track to achieve that. February is a banner month to be able to show that. It is, of course, Spay-Neuter Awareness Month, and so we did a lot of media with that together with PAWS. And the more we beat the drum on those very basic initiatives that are really, not earth-shattering, they're all things that we know need to happen, but we do start to see the impact of that when we look at shelter intake. Okay, so similarly, in February, we had 173 pets euthanized, 82 were cats, 65 were dogs. We did euthanize one pigeon that was injured, one raccoon, and 24 skunks. So we started to see a lot more skunks on the move. The skunks and raccoons happen most commonly when private citizens are setting live traps on their property. They call us and let us know, hey, I have caught something. It's very difficult to relocate a skunk without my staff getting sprayed, without the skunk, being in the right location it needs to be in. And so our policy has been, if we have skunks and traps, we go ahead and euthanize at that time, just because they are that high risk for rabies and very difficult to relocate. It is our goal to not impact wildlife that much and to relocate whenever possible. So there were those few wildlife euthanasias there.
Mention about rabies, did I miss?
So
Were any rabid?
Was one rabid
Is that
skunk
the one
in
skunk
February.
that you talked about before, or is this another one?
No, sir. The one rabid skunk I spoke about before, we didn't report as euthanized because it actually was dead on arrival.
Yeah.
And so in February, we did observe a skunk active during the day, showing signs of paralysis. He would just walk in circles, and we were like, that. A citizen called us. We had done a lot of media about, if you see these things, call us. And so a citizen did. He said, I just have a skunk laying in my front yard, and I can go out there and walk right up to him, and I haven't touched him. There's been no exposure, but he's wildlife. Why isn't he running off? And we said, we will be right there. And so we got there. We observed the skunk, unable to walk properly. And so we did go ahead and do a test on that animal that came back positive for rabies. So there was no human exposure, but we did confirm that animal was rabid as well. So one of the 24 skunks in February was rabid.
So now we're up to 3?
I'm sorry, no, there was one in February that the dog killed, and one in January that the dog killed, and one in February that we euthanized. 2 rabid specimens in San Angelo.
No.
Different
So
area.
we talked about 2 skunks now that were rabid and 1 fox.
No, sir, my apologies. There were no rabid foxes.
Oh, I thought you said rabid fox. I'm
My
sorry.
apologies.
That was,
It-
you were talking about the skunk. The last.
It was one
Yeah.
skunk.
Do we check all skunks that come in if they're rabid?
No, we only check skunks. We only check any of the high-risk carriers for rabies, which are skunks, coyotes, raccoons, bats, and foxes. We only check them if there's been a human exposure or if they're behaving suspiciously,
Okay, all right.
because of the expense to the state and ourselves.
Yeah, I know it's not, yeah. Okay,
The state doesn't charge us to test those specimens, but we send them FedEx overnight, which adds up. And we used to send them by bus ticket, which became problematic. So for a very comparable price, we send them by FedEx overnight to the state lab. So that's about a $40 expense every time we send off a head specimen, not to mention the cost to the state once it arrives for them to obtain that and test it. I'm sorry, was there another question? Oh, I wanted to speak to that. Yes, ma'am. Thank you for that. So the first incident where a skunk wandered into the private citizen's home was in the Paul Ann neighborhood, and we did notify within a mile radius of that area, leaflets to each door, and then the skunk that wandered up in this person's yard was north of Goodfellow over on Era Street off of Paint Rock Road in Era. So not the same parts of town. The residence in Paul Ann is very close to a natural area. The area in Goodfellow is not. So that's one that we're kind of tracking, and we have a great support from the state in tracking, the movement of these animals. For example, the skunk that was rabid in January was a hognose skunk, which is not the most common skunk that you're going to see in our area, and it was carrying a strain of rabies that is the striped skunk strain of rabies, which means a striped skunk bit a hognose skunk. We tested the hognose skunk. It has striped skunk rabies. Okay. Then in February, it was a striped skunk, which are very prevalent in our area, and it had striped skunk rabies.
the same thing as far as flyers and stuff in that area as well?
We did. Even though there was no human or animal exposure, we did go a mile radius. And when we talked to the state about that, they said, well, if you want to, I mean, it's a little overkill. There's no human exposure. And they see rabid cases all the time. Like I said, there are communities near us that have dozens a year. And we got our first one and we're like, what do we do? What are all the things? How do we make sure and just be really proactive? And so we opted to do that. With the support of the state, and they said, you know, it's certainly your option, but not a requirement. So we did do the same thing where we went door to door with leaflets. Of course, most folks were not home, so we just left the information, but we did have opportunity to speak to several folks, and we just said the best thing you can do is, one, not handle wild animals ever, and two, make sure that your own domesticated pets are rabies vaccinated. And we're just diligent in it, because I think in 2007, Tom Green County led the nation in rabid horses. And so it's just, you know, in the rest of the world, rabies is, so everywhere, rabies is fatal, right? And if you actually contract full-blown rabies, there is no treatment for it. And in the world, 100,000 deaths occur every year because of humans contracting full-blown rabies. So in the United States, you don't see anything like that, those numbers. Maybe a couple dozen a year humans in the United States dying from rabies, and it's because of diligent animal control. It's because of making sure folks are aware of how to handle wildlife, which is to not handle it and to call authorities. And so it's something that we're diligent in, and you'll see it, you know, we're part of the western region of the Department of State Health Services, and so we are compared side by side with very rural areas. So when we have one or two cases of rabies, they're like, okay, it's no big deal, right? But to those other areas, they have a larger number of positive rabies specimens every year. So I appreciate y'all letting me kind of go down that rabbit trail. So another way to break down the number of animals euthanized, 45 were either sick, injured, or failure to thrive. 59 were feral cats, of course, not microchipped. 43 were euthanized due to aggressive or bite quarantine. 24 were wildlife, and 2 were owner requested. So again, 0 pets euthanized for time and space, and I can't brag enough about February was our banner month for live release rate of 71%. That's really something that y'all can report back to your peers and in the community as something that's working. When we first adopted the no-kill initiative, we had a plan of how quickly we would hit these metrics of certain live release rates, and we're well ahead of schedule of doing that. I think the initiatives and investments that we've made are working, and we were very, very glad to see February's figures.
Any questions?
Yeah, on these reports, since we've now had 2 rabid, I would request that we add a category on here showing the rabid we've had and any additional rabbits and comments about where that came from and so on in this report. We definitely don't want to see an outbreak of rabies in this area, if at all possible. So.
Yes, sir.
Anyone else? Next item agenda item is follow-up and administrative issues.
I don't have anything for the committee's consideration. Also, if there are any future agenda items you wanted to consider, we could look at them at this time, but I don't have anything to report.
Anyone have anything else? That being said, I will adjourn this meeting.
We have a motion to that
Motion
effect.
to adjourn this meeting, sorry. Second. All in favor?